I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and we're coming off a Monday pod in which we went 3-4 against the spread, but we're still kicking at 22-15 overall in the play-in/playoffs. Combine that with a 34-19-1 record overall for the NBA picks. Things are still rolling. But at the same time, there's lots going on here in the world of betting, as there's also a very popular thing going on Thursday because it involves the NFL, and we know that the NFL is king. So what is going on there with you, my dude?
Yeah, and just to let people behind the curtain, right? We try to do a NFL draft specific podcast, but it's like a game of double dutch, man. Like, when do you hop in to record something that is going to sort of be the I don't want to say Bible or whatever, but like our guide to betting the NFL draft? Like, it's impossible to do because, you know, something happens seemingly every day to shift the equation here, right? And so obviously it starts with the first pick overall, right? It's this 3-month process that we're trying to grab, you know, bets and try to grab value. And this has been a really fun draft to try to handicap. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be profitable. Hopefully that's the case. And hopefully you followed my stuff over at The Score, because that's been the sort of venue where I can sort of populate, okay, 2 weeks ago, let's write about this. 10 days ago, let's write about that. A week ago, blah, blah, blah. Listen, I started writing about the draft back in January, trying to analyze, all right, what are the Jags going to do? This is before they even had a head coach, right? And we had the idea, okay, like they're going to hire an offensive coach here. They should be, who should then put a focus on drafting an offensive lineman for Trevor Lawrence. Like, that would make a ton of sense to me. And so what's happening here with the Jags is there's this internal struggle, right? And it's your guy, former 49ers general manager Trent Baalke, and Doug Peterson, obviously. And they're fighting about, okay, Peterson wants an offensive lineman, Baalke obviously wants a defensive end. And so the issue was, for me, and, you know, call it experience, you know, there's, you know, no substitute for experience, and just seeing this market. And when Hutchinson would never really create higher than minus 300 over the course of months and months, where we always see when it comes to the draft, the first pick ends up being 2 weeks, 3 weeks before, like minus 10,000, right? And it just never sort of made sense that, okay, Aidan Hutchinson is clearly sort of the number one from a branding standpoint, the sort of top prospect. But if that's the case, then why isn't he minus 10,000? Why haven't the Jaguars been trumpeting this guy the whole time? And the answer was, and it was pretty clear as day to me, it was Hutchinson's the most marketable guy. And if you wanted to trade down, you wanted to talk, I don't know, Detroit, who's right behind you, right? His, you know, I think he's from like Dearborn, Michigan, obviously went to University of Michigan. If you're trying to sort of trick Detroit to move up one spot, a la like the Bears moving up to grab Mitch Trubisky a few years ago, where you go, okay, you're going to give us something to tell so that we don't take Hutchinson? Are you going to give us something that we don't take Hutchinson? Like, that's the sort of game that they were playing. Now, kudos to the Lions, whether it was information or stubbornness or whatever. They were like, no, we're not going to give you anything to take Hutchinson. We're going to dare you to pick Hutchinson. And over the last week, it's become pretty clear. And you see, again, speaking of reading the tea leaves and reading the market, meanwhile, you see another defensive end, another edge rusher, Travon Walker, slowly moving up the odds board, right? This guy was not even on the radar for number one pick overall back when I was writing about the draft in January. But you start to see him populate. He's like, okay, he's 10-1 now. Okay, he's 5-1 now. Well, why would he move up like that, right? The simple answer is because the Jaguars like him, right? And the information, while not rock solid, no one's coming out and saying anything, it's pretty clear that this horse is coming up on the outside here in Travon Walker. And it would make sense if an offensive lineman was sort of coming up on the outside in the way that we had Evan Neal as the favorite at one point. It would make sense of some other position, but we're talking an edge rusher, the same sort of position and skill set that Aidan Hutchinson has. And so when you see that, you go, okay, like there is smoke to that fire. And whether or not they end up picking Aidan Hutchinson, listen, they could still theoretically pick him. Though now we're looking at what, minus 400 for Walker. It seems like that's the done deal. But like, if the guy that everybody thinks is all these mock drafts, right? And everybody's got sources, right? And I always look at this and I go, yes, this is an information situation where if you see a line move day of the draft, like we are in today, like, yeah, I would make that bet relatively comfortably because we are on draft day. But 2 weeks ago, right? Any information is by and large just total BS. And these guys who have sources are being led astray for the purposes of the team. Those teams are trying to maneuver guys around. You've seen, maybe you've seen the article about Evan Neal's alleged injury issue that he has. Well, is that real? Or is that just one team hoping Evan Neal falls to them and leaked some sort of bunk information, right? Like that's the stuff that we're dealing with. And so you can just look at the market and sort of read all of this stuff, right? You can sort of see, okay, Hutchinson should, if he's this much of a lock with all these mock drafts, he should be better than a minus 300. So I think that has to be sort of made up. And then Walker ends up taking his place as the favorite. And then Hutchinson's still like plus 200, as if that makes any sense. Because if this internal like disagreement here or this debate about offensive line or defensive end exists, but we've already, if you're the Jags, ranked Walker ahead of Hutchinson, Hutchinson should be like plus 5,000, right? He should be like 50 to 1 because they've already said we have Walker rated higher than Hutchinson. Not literally, but, obviously within the marketplace. Now, if they shift gears and they go, you know what, we want Ike Ekwonu because we do want to protect Trevor Lawrence here and he can play right tackle and we've extended Cam Robinson and that could theoretically be a strength to our team going forward. Okay. And I think that's an interesting element too here where you had Evan Neal and Ike Ekwonu both at like 15, 18 to 1 for the longest time. But what was sort of went under the radar is with that shift from Walker to go to first overall, Ike Ekwonu started to separate as well. He's in the plus 4, plus 500 range. And so he seemingly, based on what the sort of underground information would indicate, is that he's their selection as an offensive lineman. So he's the offensive lineman pick if they wanted to go that way, if Peterson ends up winning the argument, and Walker is the pick if Baalke ends up winning the argument. Now, to me, logically, I would think that Peterson should win the argument. Trevor Lawrence is going to be way more important to their success than Travon Walker or Aidan Hutchinson ever would be. It's the Jags. Right. And you can bring in a guy like Peterson who's won a Super Bowl and maybe he's a really good coach and maybe he's a really good talent evaluator. Who knows? But it's very jaggy to bring that guy in and then not listen to him in favor of Trent Baalke, a guy who thought it was a good idea to bring Urban Meyer in as the head coach. And so the problem is, if it was logic based and all of that sort of thing, we would be cashing tickets with Ekwonu here. And I would be saying, hit Ekwonu plus 400, blah, blah, blah. I've got, Ekwonu tickets from 15 to 1 back when, again, I wasn't buying into this Hutchinson situation. The problem is, logic doesn't matter when you're dealing with some of these teams. And that's why the Jags are on back-to-back years of drafting first overall, which is actually like a really difficult thing to accomplish. And so, yeah, it looks like Walker's the play here. Don't go ahead and start piling in on minus 400. Obviously, things got a little late there. But again, if you've been following my stuff on the score, you would have seen over 1.5 for Hutchinson was a thing that I've been ringing the bell on here for a really long time. So we're in really good shape because that's now obviously, him to be over 1.5 is like minus 300, minus 400. It's starting to match the price of Walker. I wrote early on in the week when this happened that the best bet to jump on was Hutchinson at minus 110 to go second. That number is now close to minus 300, right? So there's different ways that you can play this draft based on the stuff that you know what's going to happen. Problem is, as we go down this order here, you get to 3 and the Texans. And again, if we're not able to rely on the Jags to do something logical to protect their, franchise quarterback, I don't know what the Texans are supposed to do that is going to be logical, right? And you're hearing some Derek Stingley stuff. He's made the big move here from in both the cornerback, first to cornerback to go market, which is one that we had success on last year with JC Horn. You've seen all kinds of crazy stuff as far as him moving into like the favorite position to be third overall. And of course, his draft position total has plummeted down to 7.5, right? So it looks like he might be the play at number 3. But again, for the second straight year, it looks like 3, when it comes to draft day, is going to be the position where we just don't know what's going to happen. And of course, that's going to set up the rest of the draft, a draft that's really interesting because of how many teams have 2 picks in this draft. So normally we can go, okay, the San Francisco 49ers, like blah, 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 they pick 8th. Like that is sort of the dead end, like this player is going to go to that spot type of thing. And you can sort of cap around that. You can't do that because the Giants have 5 and 7. Are they going to play it like fantasy football? So for example, if Travon Walker goes number 1, Hutchinson number 2, and maybe a cornerback goes number 3 to Houston, I think the Jets are going to grab a defensive player, whether that's Sauce Gardner or Kayvon Thibodeau. Then you get to the Giants, who want an offensive lineman. They are absolutely going to select an offensive lineman in this draft. But you know how it works in fantasy, right? Like if you're sitting there and you have a pick at the back end of a round, and maybe it's back-to-back picks, or maybe you've got a pick and somebody else has back-to-back picks. But you know that they're not going to take a quarterback, for example, because they just took a quarterback. You know that you don't need to take a quarterback with your first pick. You can wait and take a quarterback when when your turn comes around in the next round. So you can grab something that maybe those guys like. So the Giants, why would they grab an offensive lineman at 5 if there's going to be between 2 and 3 guys available to them? Do they really think Evan Neal is better than Charles Cross, or Cross better than Neal, or Cross better than Ekwonu, right? Does it really matter to them if they can grab somebody of impact at 5 that maybe Carolina wants at 6? Problem is, nobody has a clue what Carolina is going to do either. Up until recently, Kenny Pickett was the favorite to be picked by Carolina. There's no chance Kenny Pickett is going to get picked by Carolina at 6. This guy's draft position number is 18.5. And he's supposed to be the favorite to get picked by Carolina, but it's because nobody has any idea what they're going to do. So it's like, I don't know, Kenny Pickett as the favorite, maybe, sure. And maybe they end up getting Kenny Pickett because they trade out of that, which, by the way, is more reason for the Giants to pick somebody sort of skill position guys, whatever. And so I think the Giants wait to 7 to take their offensive lineman. And so I think there's a bunch of different options that are really heavy underdogs at 5 that you can start picking, mixing and matching. Maybe the Giants like Jameson Williams. That's a pretty big underdog at the 5th overall pick. What if they like any of those wide receivers? They've obviously, people have heard that they're trying to trade Kadarius Toney. That would mean that they'd be in the market for a wide receiver, for example. Yeah. So I just think that there's a bunch of different ways, and it's very interesting. And there's a ton of plus money type things here, but the plus money type stuff at this point, when it's a 50-50 type of thing, you don't want the plus money, right? This isn't a value thing where you and I come on and we say, listen, I think these teams are dead even. If I'm getting getting points with this team, if I'm getting plus 3.5 points, I'm going to take the points. This isn't to take the points situation, because if a thing is an underdog in a 50-50 situation here, it is for a reason. That's why we make these bets 3-4 weeks ago. If something's a plus underdog when there's 10 different options, well, then that means that there's maybe some betting opportunity there, right? And you just have to figure out which guy or which set of guys is, something that you want to play. One thing that I looked at was the 9 spot in this draft. I think that's a really good spot for a wide receiver to get taken. Why? Because Seattle wants to trade out. There's a bunch of these teams, not that surprisingly, that have needs of basically infinity, right? Like, what do the Seattle Seahawks need? Everything. What do they not need? A wide receiver. Well, at 9, there's probably going to be 2 to 3 of the top wide receivers available. We have seen the market for wide receivers being ridiculous in what Tyreek Hill got, Devontae Adams got, go on down the line here. What Deebo Samuel is trying to get, by the way. And so the Jets are sitting there and they don't have a premier wide receiver. They're sitting there at 10. And they might trade that to the 49ers. We've heard that. Well, I'd love to get your take on the Deebo Samuel situation at some point. But they might trade that to the 49ers for Deebo Samuel, at which point would you be surprised if the 49ers drafted a wide receiver? I certainly wouldn't, right? Like, that makes a lot of sort of economic sense for the 49ers to do, right? You get a cost-effective wide receiver plus some other stuff from the Jets. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. If you see that, whether or not it's the 49ers in that spot or the Jets in that spot, if you're a team, wouldn't you want to trade up to 9 with the Seahawks to make sure that you grab the wide receiver that you want. And so there's a ton of wide receivers, the Williams, the Drake Londons, the Garrett Wilsons, that are all in the double digits to go in the 9th overall pick. And so you can use those 3 guys and sort of splash them all together, so a little sprinkle around a unit to end up getting to a 4-1, 5-1 type of bet that a wide receiver goes to the 9th overall pick, not Seattle specifically, right? Because the reason those guys are such underdogs at this point is because the only thing Seattle has right now anyway are wide receivers. But if it's not Seattle picking, all of a sudden wide receivers become a lot more valuable in that spot. So the further you go down, the crazier it gets. And again, anytime, you can sort of grab something at an underdog price that, again, isn't a 50-50 type thing, you want to do it the further down the draft because you want more crazy stuff to potentially happen. When it gets to the end of the draft, there's a handful of guys. Again, I've wrote about who I like to maybe get in the first round. But at this point, the bet that's still available out there is over 15.5 defensive players to go in the first round. I think that's going to be a coveted, obviously, side of the ball, but certain positions, secondary, edge rusher, et cetera, are going to be guys that are getting reached for at the end of the first round. The thing to remember at the first round, the difference between the first round and the second round, right, is that you get a 5th year. You get that team option for a 5th year. So you want guys at high expense positions because you can keep cost certainty at that position. Look at like edge rusher or cornerback, right? You get to 4 years, you got to pay for a really good corner. You got to pay for a really good defensive end. You got to pay for a really good wide receiver now. You don't really have to pay for a middle linebacker. You don't really have to pay for a running back. You don't really have to pay for a safety. So why would you bother grabbing one of those players at the end of the first round, knowing that even if they're a good player after 4 years, it's not going to be that expensive. Right. Whereas like a defensive end, if that guy's balling, if a wide receiver is balling after 4 years, you get to use their, the team option for that 5th year and save that money that we have seen is getting thrown around on guys like Christian Kirk at this point in time. Right. And if you can save a year of having to pay the Christian Kirks of the world, you absolutely do it. So when you're making your bets about the first round and stuff that's happening at the end of the first round, keep in mind positional scarcity, positional value, because it all comes down to the salary cap and how you're chopping up your pie. And so to me, that's the way to play it. And then as far as the quarterbacks is concerned, it's funny. It's the NFL draft, and I haven't mentioned a quarterback at this point other than the Kenny Pickett not going to Carolina situation. I think Malik Willis, somebody is eventually going to reach for me. Malik Willis, I did take a little under 13.5 on him. I have him first quarterback taken. I have him at plus money from earlier on. If you're able to grab the minus 150s that were out earlier on the week, hopefully you were able to do that. There's just no reason to reach for Pickett. He doesn't have the upside. And the further we get away from actual college football being played, the less actual college football matters. And so in college football, our guy, Kenny Pickett, man, we thought he could win the Heisman. I think he actually went to New York, right? I think he got the invite to New York. Doesn't matter, man. People want upside, whether it's NBA draft or NFL draft, and Malik Willis provides that upside. There are a ton of different teams, long shoddy type teams that could pick Willis. My favorite one, my 2 favorite ones, one, I think the Saints, there's a reason they have 2 picks, that they went out of their way to get 2 picks in the first round so that they can move up. Do they move to 6? Do they move to 8? Do they move to 9? You know what I mean? There's a bunch of different ways that they can move up to go and grab their quarterback of the future if they're not fully bought in on Jameis Winston for the next 5 years. The other one, Tampa Bay, is like 38-1 to get Malik Willis. If there was ever a team that could sort of use, as they say, a luxury first round pick, it's a team that had to spend a couple of weeks of their lives thinking about life after Tom Brady and looking around at the roster and going, we have everything on this roster by and large, except a quarterback of the future. That might be a team you can sort of mortgage the future a little bit by putting some picks together along with their first round pick to hop up and grab Malik Willis if he ends up sliding right now. He's 13.5, I think is his number. So they'd have to, obviously throw some future stuff into the mix. But when you're talking about future stuff, maybe quarterback of the future is the play. Otherwise, I think the Bucs are not tank necessarily, but we're going to probably be really bad with Kyle Trask or, Blaine Gabbert, whoever is going to be quarterback for the Bucs. And the quarterback draft next year is looking pretty loaded, right? You got your Bryce Youngs, your CJ Strouds, et cetera, et cetera. But now that Tom's back, and they're never going to tell Tom not to show up. Now that Tom's back, it's like, well, let's just go for this year. And the roster is pretty, loaded. They don't need anything necessarily here. They didn't really play Tryon Shoyinka last year, their first round pick from last year. Why not? Why not take a shot here and have a project type of a quarterback here? So, and we're talking about a 38-1. So when I say it's fun, it usually means it's going to lose, but we might have a fun sweat if Willis starts to drop and crazy stuff starts to happen in this NFL draft, as it always does.
Yeah, NFL draft, always a great time of year, of course.